Lee Forrester. Time for another installment of Metal on Metal TCS Talk. We're going to do introduction number 4 today, and that is dealing with spotting and line of sight. To those of you who've already taken a look at a TCS game, the line of sight rules are interesting, and that's one of the points I think that distinguishes the game series and also makes it complicated for beginners. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk first of all about visibility, how far units can see. Spotting ranges, which is the ability to actually see specific units that are on the map, depending on their range from friendly units. And then we'll go over the various line of sight rules that the TCS has. There are actually 3 different ways of doing line of sight. I'll talk about my preferred method. We'll go over the standard method, not really talk much about the really simple method, but the main point that I want to make with the line of sight is, yes, it's hard if you're not used to reading contour maps until you get used to it, but try to relax. Don't let this put you off the TCS games. It's a process, and actually different people read the map slightly differently. So it's not supposed to be a tournament game like ASL where you're going to play every single rule to your advantage. It's really about having a realistic experience with these games. And I invite you all to take the line of sight rules in that spirit of relaxing about it. So let's look first of all at visibility. That's pretty straightforward. Visibility will depend on either weather or light, and it will determine the maximum range that you can see other units in this game. It's usually set by the weather, or it can also be set by the time of day. And in some games, I'm coming up with Ariete, there's rules of sandstorms and blowing sand that limits the visibility. And we'll take a look here at the visibility chart. This is for Canadian Crucible, one of the most recent games. And you'll see here that the visibility is given according to the light, and that during twilight, the visibility is 3 hexes, 5, 10, and if it's not otherwise noted, it's unlimited. Now, the reason why we distinguish between weather and lighting is that illumination rounds, can change your spotting range at night. What illumination rounds do is basically around a certain range, each of 3 or 5 hexes from the illumination round, depending if it's artillery or mortar. Everything there is if it's in daylight, and there's unlimited spotting to it, unless naturally it's blocked by things like weather. Snow, it doesn't matter. If there's snow everywhere, you can only see a certain amount of hexes. So that's all there is to the basic range that we've had, visibility that we looked at. The next thing to talk about is spotting ranges, and these are the ranges that units have to other units that allow them to fire. And we've talked very quickly about the different kinds of fires in TCS. There are point fire actions, which are targeted heavy caliber rounds shooting a specific target. Think anti-tank guns, or tank guns is one of the best things for PFAs. There are overwatch fires, which we'll go to in great detail later. Those involve responding to either enemy fire or enemy movement. And then there are suppressive fire actions, SFAs, which involve lighting up with everything you got, spraying rounds at a target hex, even though you don't exactly know it's there. Usually area targets, but this is not targeted sniper-like fire. This is just suppressive fires where you're shooting everything you got there to keep their heads down. So that will affect, the spotting ranges will have different effects on those kind of attacks. If it's a point fire attack, since it's an attack that's targeted at a specific unit, if you can't see it, you can't conduct the attack. So you're not allowed to conduct a PFA against an unspotted target. Likewise with Overwatch, Overwatch is response to enemy activity that you see. If the activity occurs beyond spotting range, you cannot fire at it. SFAs, however, can be fired whether the target is spotted or not. But if there are no spotted targets in the hex, you'll find that there are serious negative modifiers to the attack roll, so there's a good chance you're not going to be able to do anything to it. How do we determine spotting ranges and whether a target is spotted or not? All firing or potentially firing units spot the same. It's the target type that you have to refer to. Area targets are harder to spot, guns are the next level up, tanks are much easier to spot. And then, particularly in the case of an SFA, when you have multiple hexes potentially firing at one target, you calculate the range of the furthest unit away. So you use the longest range of all firing units. PFAs, that could work with PFAs too. With the Overwatch, it's not going to matter because only one hex ever responds to an Overwatch fire. Let's take a look at the table. At the top, we have the range, and beneath it, we have the target type. So the spotting range for area targets or AT guns is 3 hexes. That's the base. The base for infantry guns, anti-aircraft guns, or on-map artillery is 4, Vehicles and carriers are 8. Now, these ranges are shifted columns to the left and the right depending on the target and fire status. It depends on terrain. So in billiard terrain, which is very open, you can see units much further away. An 8 target you can spot at 6 hexes distant. Partly protective or protective shifts you the other way. So to fire at an area target in a partly protective or protective hex such as a city or woods, you have to be 2 hexes away. If there is a fired marker on the target hex, or if the target hex is in the act of firing, that is firing Overwatch, movement-based Overwatch, you have +4 columns. So if an infantry unit is in woods and it has a fired marker on it, what's the spotting range? We start with the area target, we move to 2 for the woods, and then over 4, and the range is 8. So you can spot that with any unit that's within 8 hexes of it. Road moving units in move mode are slightly easier to spot. Night obviously is a big downer on spotting things. Dug-in status can make things very difficult. If you have a dug-in anti-tank gun in heavy terrain, it's going to have -1 for the protective and -1 for dug-in. Spotting range is adjacent. So these things can hold their fire until you creep right up on them and then decide to fire or not. Now, on the other side, if your troops are dug in, you get a +1 to spotting the enemy, and that's because you've cleared out lines of fire, set yourselves up in specific locations to take advantage of whatever local terrain there is. So if you're dug in and infantry is approaching you in the open, what is the spotting range? All right, basic A target is 3. The infantry is in move mode, shift 1 over. If the fire is dug in, shift another one, and then suddenly your dug in machine guns and infantry platoons can fire at infantry that's moving 6 hexes away, which really gives you a chance to, well, I won't say button them up, but to suppress them before they get very far in their attack. You might be beginning to get the idea that suppressing enemy units is a really important factor in this game so that you can advance against them, because suppressed units cannot fire Overwatch, and they're also pretty bad at spotting anyway. They get a -1 even if they're trying to do an SFA. So that we'll get to that later in the tactics, but the spotting table will give you already that sort of inkling that units that are well prepared and dug in can see you much before you can see them. Let's take an example here. I'm going to run a little movie that I did. Well, let's see if it works. Let me back up. All right, we're running a movie I did. Here are some German infantry moving up to the Canadians. So they've moved to this hex and moved up. And that's 3 away, and that's easily within spotting range of these Canadians. So these Canadians can elect to fire at that if they wish. It's within 3. They could actually spot those at 4 away, or even 6 away if the Canadians had been dug in. And if you check the elevation, you'll see they couldn't fire there because it was blocked because of the elevation, but now they can fire here. This unit's moved into fire mode to give Overwatch protection. This next unit is moving up. It's the same deal. 3 hexes away is not a problem. Against infantry moving across the open, you can spot them at 4 or even 6. Now let's just suppose this thing creeps up and moves into fire mode and it doesn't get totally shot up in the process. This can now spot the other unit if it wanted to, because it's 2 hexes away. Unless it's dug in, then it still can't. This machine gun that's over here is not going to be much use because it's a long distance away. It has no chance of spotting the Canadians, and the Canadians cannot spot it because it's beyond their maximum range. Either 3 for if it's not dug in, or 4 if it does dug in and it's too far away for that. So that gives you some idea. If you're dug in, so like this Canadian unit is here, you can hold your fire as long as you want, and these units are not going to be able to spot it for a long time. Now, if this unit here moves, say while it was still in move mode, and this fires at it, can the machine gun do return Overwatch? Let's just say it's dug in and calculate this out. So it's an area target, base 3, -1 shift for the terrain, minus another shift for being dug in. That brings it down to the 1. But if it just did movement-based Overwatch, and this is a return Overwatch, which we'll talk about in a future video, that adds 4 columns. So we're moving for the 1, 2, 2, 2. That's 6. Are we in range? We are just barely in range. So if you wanted to, this unit could spot them for return Overwatch fire. But once that opportunity is over, there's no firing on it. There's no fired marker, so he has to be adjacent or within 2, depending on the dug-in status of this unit, to spot it. So that's a quick look at spotting. Now let's look at line of sight. Again, I want to say relax, don't stress it out. Don't stress yourself out. It may take a while to get used to reading contour maps. Just look at this as a fun new skill you're developing. It's nice and realistic, so the TCS does give you realistic looking maps, which are, I think, levels in interest above things like Panzerblitz or other pancake layer maps. Adjacent units can always spot each other. That's an important rule. So even no matter what the terrain is, if you're adjacent to an enemy unit, you can spot it. You can spot into smoke hexes if other things are equal, but not through them. Smoke goes up infinitely. It's of infinite height. Blocking terrain may or may not. You can shoot into it without a problem. If your line of sight is through blocking terrain, it'll depend on how high the blocking terrain is. Each terrain adds a certain amount of elevation to the hex it's at. The normal is 20 meters. Some games will specify if it's 10 meters or even 5 meters. And the two rules we'll look at here are the standard rules for the tracing line of sight, and we'll talk about the contour head, that is for those who really like to eke out as much of the realism as they can. Let's take a look at how the standard rules handle elevations. So in this hex here, or this map, you see what's a hilltop. This is the highest elevation. In the standard line of sight rules, can treat this as flat. Is that totally realistic? No. Is it simple? Yes. So that's sort of a compromise between super simple and really complicated. Hilltops are flat, and the bottoms, sort of the lowest elevation, is flat. So this all here would be 40 meters, and that's it. You don't have to ask yourself any other questions. Things in between the contours. You determine the elevation of the hex by checking the line between, you go through where you find the shortest range between these two contours. You split it up into fourths, and you find where is the center dot on that thing, and then whatever closest one it is, that's the elevation. So what does that mean? Here is the dot of the center hex. Of these four quarter lines, the closest one is to this one right here. So this is going to be, this hex is treated as if it's 80 meters high, because that's the closest terrain thing it is. Now, if it's running through the dot, then use, obviously, if the line is through the dot, use the 60 right here, because that's the closest. Over here, if you were to trace for this hex here, here's the dot, here's the line between there. It's closest to the quarter mark, so between 60 and 80, a quarter of the way is 65, and this hex is now treated as 65 meters high. So that's how you determine the elevation of hexes in the standard approach. This is a little bit better, well, I think significantly better than a pancake model. Suppose we just treat everything as, whatever the hex is in that contour, that's it. So this is going to be 60, and this then will also be 60 because the dot is in the 60-meter contour. But when you start tracing longer lines of sight, that leads to some funny blockages because the hexes are in such blocky, pancake-level things that some line of sights are blocked that intuitively really shouldn't be blocked. Right, now I'm not going to go over all these illustrations. There are about a page and a half in the rules with this map showing how to trace the line of sight from various hexes to other hexes and discussing whether the line of sight is blocked or not. I encourage you, if you're just starting out with reading contour maps, to start practicing those. Take a look at, if you want to trace from A to G, try it out, see what you come up with, and then see how it matches up to the description of the rules. Now, let me back up and say, I'm not sure if I mentioned this important concept, and that is the point of contention. This is a little different than other games I've played with line of sight. In those games, the instructions will be, check the line of sight and see if it's blocked. In the Tactical Combat series, actually it is, declare your attack, and then the enemy gets to make a point of contention along the line of sight and say, hey, I think the line of sight is blocked at this point. If your opponent does that, then you check the line of sight at that point. If it's blocked, the fire doesn't happen. If it isn't blocked, it does happen. It doesn't matter if there are other points that might be better candidates or that might actually block the line of sight. Why do the rules have this? It simplifies things. Rather than having to check 3 or 4 hexes, your opponent eyeballs it, takes one stab at it, and if it's blocked, it's blocked. If not, it's not. So that's what the point of contention is about. It's the point that your opponent selects along the line of sight. In a standard rules, it's going to be a hex that you'll check. If you move to the contour head rules, it's going to be a specific point in a hex. And speaking of which, why don't we move right to the contour head rules. How do these differ? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, the point of contention can be a specific point in a hex, not just the hex itself. that might make a difference in terms of how the map lays out. That's much more satisfying if you like reading contour maps, but again, it takes a little bit more work because the map's going to be a little more complicated. Hilltops are no longer considered to be flat. The center of the hilltop is considered to generally be half a contour higher. If there are points of interest or elevation marks, those are treated in the contour head rules, and you're instructed to ignore those in the standard rules. And bottoms also don't just flatten out, but they drop, you find the lowest possible point on the map, and that's considered half a contour lower. So let's take a look at how that might differ over here. If we're tracing a fire from G to H, if we're using the standard rules, the hilltops, this is obviously at 80 meters. This is also within the 80-meter contour. Hilltops are considered flat. The fire from A to H is not blocked by anything on these hilltops. These woods are 20 meters high. And if we look at here, this elevation is 40 in the standard rules because it's all flat. 40 plus 20, 60, so they're not high enough to block this. G firing to H is not a problem in the standard rules. Now, if we use the contour head rules, this elevation here is going to be pretty close to 90. What we're going to do is this here, the middle of it, is going to be half a contour higher is 90. So then I'm just eyeballing it from here to there. We're going to call that hex 85 meters, if this is sort of our notional top of the hill. Over here, however, we have an elevation spot marking of 96. And this is on the other side of it, going down from 96 down to 80. So this is going to be about 88. And 96 is in front of it. In that case, this line of sight is blocked. Which way you play really depends. Is it okay for a game to have a line of sight okay with one set of rules and blocked with another? I think so, because it just depends on how complicated you want things to get. I enjoy reading contour maps. I enjoy finding little dead spots and using the elevation things and thinking that we're getting as realistic as we can be. Naturally, the maps don't represent everything. And one general principle of line of sight tracing should be is if it's ever in doubt, it's blocked, because it's usually in real life a lot harder to see things than games make it out to be. That's quick introduction to sort of the differences between those. Remember to keep the TCS games in perspective. This is not a series that's made for 2-hour rapid tournament play where all the rules are known and you're playing for exact tactics and all that, like I imagine ASL or some other games. This is about watching a battle narrative unfold. And the line of sight is part of that narrative. Sometimes you're going to look at a map and think something's not blocked, and it actually is. Just deal with it. This happens in real life too. When in doubt, your line of sight is blocked. If you really like to argue with things with your opponent, just roll dice to see what happens. I can guarantee you that one particular line of sight is not going to make or break any particular TCS game. Come to an agreement with your opponent how you enjoy playing the game most and how you want to treat line of sight. And remember, any game, sure, winning's cool, but it's about the whole experience. And that's, I think, whether you fully accept it or not, at least you will understand a little bit of why the line of sight rules are the way they are. They're trying to help bring in the best feeling of reality we can get. And it's actually very difficult with a board game to do that. So this is sort of our crack at reading line of sight rules. So, what did we talk about in this episode? We talked about spotting line of sight. We talked about visibility affected by weather or lighting conditions. We talked about spotting ranges, which allow you either to fire like a PFA or an Overwatch, or affect a fire if it's a suppressive fire action. We went over the basics of line of sight. We talked about the standard method. We talked about the contour head method. We didn't even talk about the real basic pancake method, which we put in there, which takes it all the way back to other games if you really want to do that. I don't, but you might. That's fine. So at any rate, try to enjoy tracing line of sight as much as possible. Just enjoy the surprises. The next thing we have coming up is fire combat. We're going to talk about those different kind of fires I've mentioned, PFAs, SFAs, and all that, so you can learn how to fire upon the units of your opponent.